Story 1. Queen Mary Hospital, the unoccupied bed, the graveyard shift is a different kind of territory for entrepreneurs, for creatives, for the freelancers who build worlds from their laptops. 2:00 a.m. is the hour of the deep dive, a quiet, productive solitude. For Nurse May, 2:00 a.m. on the surgical ward of Queen Mary Hospital was the same, but the product was life. It was a holding action against the chaos of the human body, a shift built on data, process, and a vigilant, caffeine-fueled calm. The Queen Mary was an institution, a brand. The old wing, where May worked, was a paradox. 19th century architecture housing 21st century tech. The corridors were too wide, the ceilings too high, and the air carried the sterile bite of industrial disinfectant layered over the faint, phantom smell of carbolic acid. A ghost in the ventilation. May's footsteps were a steady, soft-souled percussion on the polished linoleum. Tap, tap, tap. A one-woman operation tonight. Overseeing the digital dashboard of her ward, she was efficient. She didn't just manage patients. She managed a system. The silence was the baseline. It was never truly quiet. There was the hum of the air scrubbers, the glacial rumble of the ice machine 2 floors down, and the distant electronic metronome of the central monitoring station. Beep, beep, beep. It was the pulse of the machine she commanded. As she passed the 300 corridor, a flicker caught her eye. Not a flicker, really. A stutter. The long fluorescent tube above her buzzed, went dim, and then flared back to a brightness that was almost aggressive. She paused, her routine broken, and that's when she saw it. Down the hall, outside room 304, the small digital panel above the door was illuminated, a soft, clinical blue, signifying occupied. May frowned. That was a glitch. It had to be a glitch. She ran the data in her head, a process as automatic as breathing. Room 304, Mr. Callahan, post-op appendectomy, discharged at 1700. Housekeeping signature, C. Jones, 1920. The room was clean, empty, and ready. It was a closed file, a completed task. She walked to the main nursing station, the glow of her monitors casting a cool light on her face. She tapped the screen. The ward map showed 304 as a green, empty square. She checked the admission logs. Nothing. She checked the transfer requests. Nothing. The system's primary dashboard, her source of truth, said the room was empty, but the hardware, the physical light on the wall 50 feet away, insisted it had a guest. It was a data integrity failure, a frustrating, bureaucratic error. Someone, probably a float nurse from the evening shift, had likely forgotten to log out of the room's terminal, tripping the occupancy sensor. It was an annoyance, a loose thread in her otherwise immaculate system. Tap, tap, tap. Her steps were quicker now, driven by the low-grade irritation of fixing someone else's mistake. She stopped at the door to 304. The blue light was bright, staining the opposite wall. She put her hand on the heavy wooden door and froze. The air around the doorway was cold, not just hospital in October cold. It was a specific, penetrating, chemical cold, like the walk-in freezer in the morgue or the sharp exhaust from a server room. Her breath plumed in front of her face, a small white cloud. Her heart, which had been at a steady, professional rhythm, gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. This was no longer a data entry error. She pushed the door. It didn't swing. It glided open on heavy, silent hinges. The room was dark, but not completely. The only light came from the city glow through the wide window and the small, active screens of the bedside equipment. The cold was a physical presence, a weight in the air that seemed to muffle sound. She could feel it on her skin, through her scrubs. There was someone in the bed, or rather, a shape, a distinct, human-long form lay perfectly still under a single, taut, white blanket. Pulled up just to the chin, beside the bed, a cardiorespiratory monitor was active. Its green line traced a perfect, steady rhythm. In the lower right corner, the digits glowed. 72 BPM. "Hello?" May said. Her voice sounded too loud, too sharp in the icy air. No response. The shape didn't move. The monitor continued its steady, healthy report. 72 beats per minute. A new patient. A transfer she wasn't told about. The irritation returned, sharper now, masking the cold knot of unease in her stomach. This was a process failure, a dangerous one. "My name is May. I'm the charge nurse tonight," she said, stepping fully into the room, her hand already reaching for the light switch. "I'm afraid I didn't get your chart. Can you tell me your name?" She flicked the switch. Nothing. She tried it again. Click, click. The overhead lights were dead. The room remained in shadow, lit only by the steady green pulse of the monitor. Fine. She would do this in the dark. She moved to the bedside, her eyes adjusting. Her professional audit began. First, the chart. She looked at the slot at the foot of the bed. It was empty. Not just the chart, but the entire plastic clipboard was gone. Second, the patient ID. She looked at the wrist of the shape under the blanket. There was no lump, no sign of the plastic band required for every single person in their care. Third, the monitor. This was the part that made her blood truly run cold. The monitor was reading a perfect 72 BPM sinus rhythm, but her eyes traced the machine itself. The EKG leads, the red, green, black, and white wires that were supposed to be stuck to the patient's chest were not just unattached. They were gone. The ports on the side of the machine were empty, dark holes. The pulse oximeter cable, which should have been clipped to a finger, was neatly coiled in its cradle. There was no data input, yet the screen was showing a live reading. It was reading a heartbeat from a patient who was not physically connected to the machine. May stared at the glowing green line. Beep, beep, beep. It was the most placid textbook rhythm she had ever seen. It was too perfect. It was the rhythm of a simulation, of a demo mode. But this wasn't demo mode. The alarms were active. The system was live. It was reading something. Her gaze shifted from the impossible machine to the impossible patient. The cold in the room was intensifying, creeping into her bones. She could feel a strange, static energy in the air, the kind that makes the fine hairs on your arms stand up. She had to know. She had to verify. Her hand, trembling just slightly, reached for the white blanket. The fabric was stiff, almost brittle with cold. "Sir? Ma'am?" she whispered. She gripped the edge of the sheet. She braced herself. For what? She didn't know. A sleeping transient. A confused patient from another floor. A body. She pulled. The blanket came away with a sharp snap. The sound shockingly loud in the room. The bed was empty. May let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It was a prank. A stupid, cruel prank by housekeeping. But her relief lasted only for a single, fractional second. The bed was empty. Yes, but it was not flat. Where the body had been, the white bottom sheet bore a perfect, deep impression. A head in the pillow, the unmistakable outline of shoulders, a torso, the heavy indent of hips, the long, straight lines of legs. It was as if a 1,000-pound man had been lying there for a decade, pressing his very essence into the foam. The bed was empty, but the shape of the person remained. May stared, her mind unable to process the two contradictory facts. She saw an empty bed, but she also saw a person. Beep, beep, beep. The monitor was still reading 72, steady, unbothered. She let the blanket fall from her hand. It pulled on the floor. Her training, her logic, the entire framework of her reality was cracking. She reached out a shaking finger, not sure what she intended to do. To touch the imprint? To prove it was real. Her finger was an inch from the shoulder depression, and the monitor flatlined. A single, piercing, digital tone, "Baa!" screamed through the room. an alarm of catastrophic failure. May ripped her hand back as if she'd been burned, and in the absolute terrifying silence that followed the alarm, she watched, frozen, as the deep depression in the mattress, the one shaped exactly like a human body, began to slowly, smoothly rise. Phantom vitals, the dead of night, in a place that never sleeps, has a different quality. It's not a peaceful silence, it's a void, a heavy blanket pressed down on the building, punctuated only by the squeak of rubber-soled trainers and the low, electronic hum of life support. For Sister Eliza Vance, the ward manager of the geriatric wing at St. Jude's Infirmary, the 2:00 a.m. hour was a personal enemy. It was the hour when exhaustion scraped against the nervous system like sandpaper, when the caffeine from her last cup of tea, her sixth of the shift, had worn off, leaving a dull, acidic residue. She was knackered, her eyes burning, her mind already drafting the handover report for the day shift. Her footsteps made no sound on the polished linoleum of the corridor. This wing of the hospital was Victorian, a relic of brick and stubbornness that had been retrofitted with modern technology. The new, energy-saving lights hummed at a frequency that set her teeth on edge, casting the corridor in a sickly antiseptic green. She was finishing her rounds, a final check-in, when she heard it. It wasn't the shrill cry of a crash alarm, thank God. It was something quieter, something wrong, a soft, mechanical hiss, click, whir. Eliza stopped, her head tilting. The sound was coming from the end of the corridor, from room 304. She frowned. Room 304 hadn't had a patient in weeks. It was the awkward room, the one with the ancient, rattling sash window and the plumbing that gurgled at odd hours. Management was using it for storage, a dumping ground for surplus IV stands and boxes of disposable curtains. The hiss, click, whir came again. It was, she realized with a jolt of annoyance, the sound of an automated blood pressure cuff inflating. For Christ's sake, she muttered, some junior nurse, or worse, a student, must have left a monitor running, wasting resources, draining a battery. It was sloppy, and in her current state, sloppy felt like a personal insult. She pushed the heavy, fire-safe door to 304. The hinges groaned in protest. The room was cold, not just end-of-corridor cold, but a deep, penetrating chill that felt at least 5 degrees Celsius lower than the ward. The air was still and smelt of dust and something metallic like ozone. The bed in the center of the room was empty, as expected. Its mattress was bare, gleaming under a tight sheet of clear plastic. The bedside table was empty. The water carafe was gone. But next to the bed, parked as if attending a patient, was a state-of-the-art rolling vital signs monitor. Its screen, a vibrant oasis of green and amber, was the only source of light in the room. Eliza stepped back, her eyes fixed on the display. The screen was active. It showed a full set of readings. BP 120, 80, mmHg, SpO2 98%, Re-SP 16 temp, 36.8 degrees. The numbers were steady, not just steady, but perfect. The kind of textbook vitals you'd write up in a teaching file. They were the readings of a healthy, living person, resting comfortably in the empty bed. Eliza's annoyance shifted to a cold, pragmatic confusion. Must be the demo mode, she said aloud, her voice sounding unnervingly loud in the small room. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out. This was a new model. She wasn't as familiar with it, but she was a professional. She tapped the touchscreen, searching for the settings or demo option. Her finger left a smudge on the pristine glass. The menu she accessed showed no demo setting active. In fact, it showed the machine was in active patient monitoring mode. She tried to power it down. She pressed the illuminated standby button. The numbers on the screen flickered, then resettled, unchanged. She held the button down for 3 seconds. Nothing. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. This wasn't just faulty. It was defiant. Right, she said to the empty room. You're coming off at the wall. She leaned over the machine, tracing the thick grey power cable from the unit's base to the socket on the wall. Her hand brushed against the stand's metal pole. It was the cold that truly shocked her. It wasn't the passive chill of the room. This was an aggressive, burning cold that felt like plunging her arm into a bucket of dry ice. It was so frigid it felt hot, and she snatched her hand back with a sharp hiss of breath the moment her skin broke contact. The hiss, click, whir stopped. The machine's low, internal hum died. The screen, which had been a beacon of green light, went black. A profound ringing silence filled the room, the kind of absolute quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, the blood rushing in your ears. The room was now plunged into near total darkness, lit only by the sliver of green light from the corridor. Eliza's heart was hammering, a frantic, unprofessional rhythm against her ribs. She stared at the blank monitor, at the empty, plastic-covered bed. Then, the monitor's screen flashed once, a brilliant, blinding strobe of green light that illuminated the room like a bolt of lightning. In that single fraction of a second, she saw it. It wasn't a ghost. It was a shape, a pressure. The plastic on the mattress was no longer smooth. It was indented, as if by the weight of a body, and rising from the mattress was the vague, shadowed silhouette of a person. It was frail, thin, and the shadows gathered where long, unkempt hair would be. The figure was in the process of sitting up, turning its head, a motion of pure, slow-motion dread. It was turning towards her. The light died. Darkness. Silence. Eliza was out of the room before her conscious mind had processed the command. She didn't run. She retreated, pulling the heavy door shut with a definitive thud. The latch clicked into place. She stood in the corridor, her back pressed hard against the opposite wall, her breath coming in short. Sharp gasps. Her hand, the one that had touched the machine, was throbbing, the skin red and stinging as if she'd grabbed a frozen pipe. She looked at her hand, then at the solid, closed door of room 304. She did not scream. She did not cry. She was Sister Eliza Vance, and she had a ward to run. She took a deep, shuddering breath, straightened her tunic, and marched back to the nurse's station. She made herself another cup of tea, ignoring the fact that her hands were shaking so violently the hot water sloshed over the rim. She didn't tell a soul. How could she? She, who prided herself on evidence-based practice, on logic and procedure. "I'm overworked," she told herself. It was a power surge, a hallucination, hypnagogia, but she never forgot. Eliza Vance never logged the incident in the official ward report, but she did file a maintenance request the next morning, citing a dangerous electrical fault with the monitoring equipment in room 304. She put in a separate request to have the room's lock changed, for security purposes, and she kept the only key. From that night on, room 304 was permanently locked. The hospital's maintenance team eventually decommissioned the monitor, claiming it was irreparably faulty, but the room itself remained empty, locked, and cold. The story, however, didn't end there. The staff at St. Jude's know the night shift. They talk. They know not to walk past 304 alone after midnight, because sometimes, long after Sister Vance retired, the new nurses on the ward, the ones running on adrenaline and caffeine, they hear it, not the whir of a cuff. That monitor is long gone. They hear a sound, a soft, steady beep, beep, beep. And if they're foolish, or brave, or just plain curious, they'll stop. They'll press their eye to the small, reinforced glass window of the locked door. They will see a room that is black and empty, but in the corner, where the monitor used to be, a small green light will begin to pulse, and on the wall, where the light casts its glow, the shadow of a person, frail and with long hair, will be sitting up in a bed that isn't there, turning its head, as if listening for the sound of the door. And the monitor, the one that doesn't exist, will keep on beeping, displaying a steady rhythmic heartbeat, For a patient who is no longer there, a single weary man on a night shift, a spectral impression in an empty, sterile bed. But that was just the beginning. For the entity that pressed itself into the mattress of bed 12 in the geriatric ward was not a resident, it was a tourist. Daniel, the agency nurse who had witnessed it, would spend the next 6 months signed off with stress. His mind forever snagged on that 2-minute lapse in reality. He would describe to his therapist, in painstaking detail, the impossible geometry of the thing, how it was both a weight and a vacuum, a shape defined only by the absence of light. He would talk about the monitors, how the pulse oximeter registered a perfect 98% saturation from a phantom finger, and how the heart monitor dutifully traced a rhythm that was steady, slow, and impossibly strong. But most of all, he would talk about the smell. It was not the familiar, metallic tang of blood or the sharp, ammoniac sting of urine. It was a cold, sterile scent, something akin to ozone and ancient subterranean stone, a smell that belonged to a place with no air, no life, and no warmth. When the shape finally sat up, a gesture that involved no limbs but rather a horrifying, vertical contortion of the linens, Daniel did not scream. He was a professional. He simply backed away, his hand outstretched, and felt the cold air rush past him as the ward door sighed open, and then shut. The monitors flatlined. The indentation on the bed vanished. And the cold, invasive scent was gone, drawn back into the city's ventilation system. What Daniel, in his terror, failed to process was the single, ephemeral detail that would have mattered most. As the presence left, it shed something on the polished linoleum floor, where no patient had walked in days, lay a small, damp clump of reddish-brown brick dust and plaster, the thing that left St. Jude's Hospital did not move with purpose, but with appetite. It was an interstitial creature, thriving in the cracks of human enterprise, in the forgotten wards, the abandoned projects, and the dead-end careers. It drifted through the sleeping London boroughs, a current of psychic cold, drawn not to life, but to the memory of it. It found its new anchor point 4.8 miles away, in a place that was a perfect monument to failed ambition, the old Haxby & Sons textile warehouse in Shoreditch. This is where we meet Chloe. Chloe was, by every definition, an entrepreneur. Her business was decay. Under the brand Urban Obscura, she had cultivated a 6-figure following and lucrative sponsorships by documenting the beauty of architectural death. She wasn't a reckless teenager with a smartphone. She was a content creator with a 4K rig, professional-grade lighting, and a broadcast-quality microphone that could capture the sound of a pin dropping 4 stories down. Her audience, like yours, consisted of professionals, designers, and investors, people who understood that there is value in the overlooked. The Haxby warehouse was her masterpiece, slated for demolition to make way for another glass and steel block of luxury flats. It was a 7-story Victorian cathedral of brick and iron, silent for 30 years. She had gained entry an hour before midnight, her movements precise and economical. She set up her tripod on the main sorting floor, a cavernous space where moonlight struggled through grime-caked skylights. The air was thick with the smell of mould and pigeon droppings. "All right, team," she whispered into her lapel mic, the audio levels peaking perfectly. Her voice was crisp, confident. "We are in. Look at this space. The ironwork on these support columns is pure 1880s Gothic revival. The sheer scale. It's a tragedy this is all coming down." She panned her camera across the detritus, her powerful beam cutting a clean cone through the darkness. She was methodical, focusing on the textures, the peeling paint, the rusted machinery left to seize up. Then, the environment changed. It began not as a sound, but as a feeling, a precipitous drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the drafty, broken windows. Chloe saw her own breath plume in the beam of her torch. Whoa, she murmured, more to herself than her audience. That is sudden. She checked her camera's battery, still full. She checked her light, still bright. It was then that she registered the smell. Beneath the odor of damp and decay, a new scent had asserted itself. It was clean, cold, and utterly alien. A sterile, mineral smell, like a circuit board doused in liquid nitrogen. That's new, she said, her professionalism wavering for the first time. She sniffed the air. Almost smells like a hospital. She turned, panning her light towards the far end of the hall, where the old administrative offices were. The beam illuminated nothing but rotting floorboards and collapsed desks. She was alone. She turned back to her camera, ready to reset, to attribute the feeling to nerves. This was the part of the job that separated the professionals from the amateurs. You felt the fear, you acknowledged it, and you pushed through to get the shot. Sorry about that, she said, forcing a smile for the lens. Just a bit of... She stopped. Her high-fidelity microphone, designed to capture the faintest whisper, had picked up a sound. It was a sound that had no place in this building of brick and iron. It was not the drip of water, the scuttle of a rat, or the creak of settling wood. It was a sound from behind her, close. It was the distinct, dragging whisper of a heavy cotton sheet being pulled. Slowly, across a polished linoleum floor, Chloe froze. Every instinct, every primal flight response screamed at her to run, but she was a creator. She was a professional. Her job was to look. Did you guys hear that? She whispered, her eyes wide, locked on the camera lens. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by a new noise, a faint, rhythmic squeak. Squeak, squeak. It was the sound of a single, unoiled caster wheel, turning slowly on a dry axle, the sound of a gurney or an empty hospital bed. Chloe was an entrepreneur. She excelled at finding the hidden value in places others had abandoned. But she was about to learn a fundamental rule of business. Some forgotten assets are, in fact, devastating liabilities, and some things that are left behind are only waiting. Story 2. The Shungwan Dispatch. Chan wasn't so much a security professional as he was a professional sitter. In the freelance security game, a world of 0-hour contracts and unsociable shifts that paid just enough to be insulting, you didn't guard things, you sat them. You sat warehouses, building sites, and, on nights like this, the husks of dead buildings. This particular husk was a former government dispatch building in Shungwan, a monolithic block of 1970s concrete and drab tile. It was now gutted, dark, and waiting for a developer's check to clear. Tonight, Chan was the only living soul in its 23 stories. The 2 o'clock a.m. patrol was, as always, pointless. He clicked his mag torch on, the beam cutting a weak yellow cone through the administrative floor. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and rotting paper. It was the same sodden, cold air that seemed to follow him from his flat in Mongkok, a persistent grey that clung to everything. His job, as defined by the agency, was to walk the route, tap the NFC fobs at each checkpoint, and prove he wasn't asleep in the lobby. The real job was to endure the boredom. His footsteps were the only sound, the rubber soles of his standard-issue boots making a dull scuff thud on the cracked linoleum. Scuff thud, then he heard it. Scuff thud. It was perfectly out of sync, a precise half-beat after his own. Chan stopped. His body went rigid, his hand tightening on the heavy torch. The corridor ahead was a throat of darkness, stretching past endless, empty doorways. The only light came from the emergency exit signs, casting a sickly green pool on the peeling paint. He listened. Nothing, only the faint hum of the ballast in the emergency light and the distant groan of the building settling. He could hear his own pulse, a dull kick in his ears. Just the acoustics, he muttered, the words sounding loud and dead in the heavy air. Bloody echo! He'd worked in empty buildings before. They were full of noise, pipes, wind, rats. A man could go spare listening to a building's guts contracting. He took a step, scuff thud, and there it was, the reply. Scuff thud. It wasn't an echo. An echo was a reflection, a fading fractional repeat. This was a statement. It was too clear, too solid. It had weight. It sounded exactly like his own boot, but as if the floor itself was mimicking him a fraction of a second later. Chan stopped again, and again. The sound stopped with him. A cold draft, smelling of the harbour and drains, snaked around his ankles. He turned, shining the torch beam back the way he had come. The corridor was empty, just a long, drab perspective of decay. Cracked windows rattled faintly, a rhythmic tick-tick-tick against their warped frames. He was a practical man. He had invoices to chase, a landlord to appease, a life that ran on spreadsheets and caffeine. He did not believe in Fuguai. That was nonsense for old popos and tourists. This was a structural issue, a loose floorboard somewhere, a resonance in the ventilation shaft. Right, he said to the dark. Let's sort this. He was testing the building, or perhaps he was testing his own sanity. He tapped his right foot, tap, a beat of silence. Then, from the darkness down the hall, tap. His blood didn't just run cold, it felt like it had turned to slush. He tried again, a different rhythm, a quick double tap, tap, tap. The reply was immediate, perfect. Tap, tap. He stood absolutely still. He wasn't breathing. He was just listening. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. He could feel the sheer, monolithic weight of the concrete around him. He was a small, soft thing in a very large, very old box. This wasn't a structural issue. This was a game. And it was his move. He refused to run. Running was for films. Running was what got you killed. Besides, he'd look a right idiot on the CCTV playback if the day shift supervisor decided to check the tapes, the cameras. He looked up. The small, black-domed eye of a CCTV camera stared back at him from the ceiling corner, its tiny red LED a single, unblinking point of light. He was being watched. He slowly, deliberately, began to walk again. He forced his legs to move, to maintain the same steady professional patrol pace. Scuff thud. His. Scuff thud. The other. He passed the old records room, its door hanging open like a broken jaw. Scuff thud. Scuff thud. He passed the lifts, their stainless steel doors covered in grime, reflecting his own distorted, green-lit face. Scuff thud, sir, scuff thud. The sound was relentless. It wasn't angry. It wasn't menacing. It was just there. It was patient. It was methodical. It was... He realized with a jolt of pure, professional dread, doing its own patrol. It was mirroring him, step for step, keeping him company. With every step, the gap felt smaller. The half-beat delay felt like it was shortening. The sound creeping up, getting closer. He could almost feel the presence of it. A cold, static pressure on his back. He had the overwhelming, childish urge to spin around, to catch it in the act, but he didn't. He kept his eyes fixed on the green exit sign at the end of the hall, the marker for the stairwell that led back down to the lobby, his sanctuary. He reached the checkpoint fob on the wall, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed his scanner to it. The device bleeped, a cheerful electronic sound that was so out of place it was almost violent. He turned the corner into the concrete stairwell, the door hissing shut behind him on its pneumatic arm. The sound of his boots changed, the scuff thud becoming a hard, echoing clack on the concrete steps. He paused on the landing, his ears straining. From the other side of the fire door, in the corridor he had just left, he heard it. One last, solitary sound. Scuff thud! It had stopped where he had turned. It was waiting. Chan didn't wait any longer. He took the stairs 2 at a time, the jangle of his keys on his belt clip sounding like a panic alarm. He burst through the door into the lobby, the sudden brightness of the fully lit space making him flinch. He was back at his desk, a small, cheap particle board island in a sea of marble flooring. His monitor displayed the silent, grey-green feeds from the upper floors. Floor 12, where he had just been, was a static, empty shot of a long, dark corridor. He sat down heavily, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was sweating, despite the chill. He stared at the screen, at the feed from the camera that had been watching him. He saw nothing, just an empty hall, dust motes dancing in the beam of his own torch, which he'd left on the floor in his haste. No, wait, he hadn't left his torch. It was right here, heavy and solid in his hand. He looked back at the screen, in the center of the frame, where he had been standing moments before. A cone of yellow light was shining up at the ceiling from a torch resting on the cracked linoleum. He watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the light on the screen clicked off, plunging the feed back into darkness. The small, cheap radio on his desk, tuned to an all-night talk station, crackled with static, and beneath the static, so faint he thought he was imagining it, Chan heard a new sound. Tap, tap, the woman in white. The security hub was a sterile bubble of artificial light and weak, machine-brewed tea. Peter Chan preferred it this way. The graveyard shift at the Spire, a glass and steel monolith that housed hedge funds and fledgling tech startups, wasn't a career. It was fuel. It was a quiet, insulated space where he could code his own analytics platform on a laptop propped up just out of sight of the official monitors. This shift, however, had felt different. The patrol on the 10th floor had been unsettling, a drafty, bitter cold in a corridor that was climate-controlled to a precise 21 degrees. A feeling so intense he'd actually turned back, his torch beam cutting through an emptiness that felt mocking. He was a man of data, of predictable inputs and outputs. Buildings were noisy, pressurized systems. Anomalies were logged, analyzed, and dismissed. Peter settled into his worn office chair, the vinyl cracking in protest. He made a proper brew this time, strong, milky, and scalding hot. A procedural tick box exercise was all that remained. Review the patrol footage, sign the log, and get back to debugging his Python script. He pulled up the feed for Corridor 10B, his fingers tapping the timestamp, 03:17 AM, on the grainy monitor. He watched a younger, more tired version of himself trudge into frame, his torch beam playing nervously on the polished concrete walls. He watched himself pass the abstract corporate art, a swirl of offensive orange and blue, and continue towards the lift bank. He saw his on-screen self pause, just as he remembered, and turn around. The figure on the screen shone his torch into the absolute, undeniable nothingness of the corridor. Then, satisfied, he turned and disappeared from view. Peter sipped his tea, his finger already on the fast-forward button, but something made him pause. A flicker, a single frame of corrupted data. Dodgy sensor, he muttered, rolling the footage back. He played it again at normal speed. There, frame 03:17:28. 10 seconds after his pixelated self had rounded the corner, something else entered the corridor. It emerged from the same direction he had, a pale, vertical line that resolved itself into a figure. It was a woman, dressed in an elegant, bone-white aodai, a traditional Vietnamese dress. The garment was pristine, spectral against the industrial grey of the hallway. Her hair was a fall of pure black ink, hanging so far forward it completely obscured her face. She didn't walk. She glided. Her feet, if she had them, were not a factor. She moved with the impossible smoothness of a camera dolly, holding a perfect, consistent distance from the floor. Peter's blood didn't run cold. His analyst brain kicked in. Right. A prank. Some content creator from the digital marketing firm on the 11th floor, pulling an all-nighter and trying to film a viral ghost video. It was pathetic. He'd have to file a report. and they'd probably get their keycard access revoked. He leaned closer, a cynical frown on his face, ready to identify the culprit. He replayed the clip. 0318 Hundrug. This was the moment he'd stopped, chilled by that phantom draft. On the monitor, 10 yards behind his digital self, the woman in white stopped too, not instantly. There was a fractional delay, like a video call with dodgy broadband, a lag of half a second. His on-screen self stood still. The entity behind him drifted to a halt. Okay, clever, very clever. They must have had a spotter. Someone watching him on another feed, communicating with the ghost via an earpiece. Then, at 031804, he watched himself turn back. He remembered the exact feeling, the sudden, illogical spike of adrenaline, the conviction that something was right behind him. The moment his on-screen head began to turn, the figure froze. It didn't stop moving. It froze, like a paused video within a playing one. 1 second, the silk of her sleeve was drifting with her phantom momentum. The next, it was stone. She stood perfectly still, a silent statue in the middle of the corridor. As his torch beam sliced through the air, and the beam didn't just shine on her, it shone through her. Peter dropped his mug. Hot tea splashed across the console, but he didn't feel it. He stared, his heart a cold, tight knot in his chest. He could see the fire extinguisher mounting on the wall behind her. The light of his torch passed through her torso, illuminating the red label. The image only slightly distorted, as if he were looking through old, imperfect glass. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a glitch. His digital self, reassured by the empty space, finally turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner towards the lifts. For a long, terrible moment, the woman in the iodide remained frozen, her body still half transparent, her head bowed. Then, as if a play button had been pressed, she unpaused. The silk of her dress began to drift again. She glided forward, but she didn't follow his path to the lifts. She moved towards the camera, closer, closer. The black, oily curtain of her hair began to fill the screen. She moved until she was only a few feet from the lens, a monochrome violation in the sterile office space. And then, as if she knew he was there, Peter, in his safe, warm room. Hours later, she stopped, slowly, with a mechanical smoothness that defied biology. She began to lift her head. Peter felt his stomach clench, a primal command to look away screaming from the base of his skull. He was frozen, pinned to his chair. He expected a face, a skull, perhaps, or something rotted and horrific. The reality was worse. There was no face. It wasn't blurred or in shadow. It was erased, a smooth, concave patch of digital nothing, as if a celestial thumb had pressed down and smudged her very identity from existence. Where her eyes, nose, and mouth should be, there was only a void that seemed to drink the light from the camera. Peter tried to breathe, but his lungs wouldn't obey. He felt a tear of pure, cold terror trace a line down his cheek. And then, the nothingness tore open. It wasn't a mouth, it was a violation, a jagged vertical rip in the fabric of the image. Starting from where her nose should be and splitting downwards, it widened, splitting the white silk of her dress, opening into a chasm of pure, roaring static. It was a silent scream that was so loud it hurt his eyes. A sound crackled from the cheap desktop speakers. Not a scream, a hiss. It was the sound of a million dead insects, of tires on wet gravel amplified into a deafening roar, of a signal trying to claw its way out of a dead channel. The screen didn't just go black, it died. A violent pop echoed in the tiny room. The monitor went dark, then the one next to it, and the one next to that. In a domino effect of catastrophic failure, the entire bank of 16 screens snapped to black, plunging the room into darkness, lit only by the emergency exit sign. Silence. The only sound was the faint electrical hiss. And it wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. Peter Chan sat in the dark for a full minute. perhaps 10. Time had ceased to have meaning. He slowly, deliberately, pushed his chair back. The scrape of its legs on the cheap linoleum was deafening. He didn't write a report. He didn't call his supervisor. He didn't bother to wipe up the tea. He logged out of the system, his fingers moving on autopilot. He picked up his jacket, the one he'd bought with his first paycheck. He left his half-finished cuppa on the desk, where it would grow cold. He walked out of the security hub, through the marble lobby, and pushed his way out of the revolving doors into the pre-dawn chill of the city. He left the spire that night and never returned. He abandoned the final month's pay, his laptop, his seed money, his meticulously coded analytics platform. He walked away from it all because some data, once seen, can't be unseen. Some anomalies defy analysis. And that specific piece of footage, the one that corrupted the entire 10th floor server and cost the company £50,000 to replace, no one ever dared try and recover it for a second look. In the corporate playbook, there is no chapter for the supernatural. There are only memos for the procedural, following the incidents on the night shift. Management responded not with an exorcist, but with an email, a deep clean, and a diagnostics team. The official narrative was one of isolated, high-stress events, tragically amplified by system-wide glitches. The floor was sanitized, the network was patched. The server logs from that night were archived under a corrupted data heading, and May and Chan, they are no longer on the night rota. May, after a mandatory 2-week leave for acute stress, was quietly transferred to the daytime accounts division. He now works in the bustling, sunlit atrium on the ground floor. He is, by all accounts, efficient, quiet, and never ever works late. His new colleagues note only that he seems startled by loud, sudden noises and refuses to join in office banter about spooky season. He has the haunted, hollow look of an entrepreneur who has seen a flagship project fail, not with a bang, but with a quiet, sickening slide into the red. Chan left the company entirely. He handed in his notice via email, citing personal reasons. His exit interview was a masterpiece of corporate non-speak. No one pressed him. Management was, perhaps, relieved. A problem that simply walks out the door is a problem solved. The night shift, of course, must be covered. Business, like the server racks, never sleeps. The new rota was filled by the mix of keen internal candidates and seasoned external contractors. They are professionals. They are the kind of people who read the Financial Times on their break, who measure their lives in billable hours and successful project rollouts. They heard the whispers about May and Chan, dismissing them as cautionary tales of burnout. They were warned the shift was demanding, but they understood that to mean the workload, not the environment. They were wrong. The building's memory proved to be longer than the company's. The patches fixed the software, but not the shadow it had cast. At first, the new staff notice only the rational. The air conditioning on that floor runs colder than elsewhere. The fluorescent lights have a habit of flickering, a high-frequency buzz that gets just under the skin. Annoyances, quirks. Every old office building in the UK has them. Then, around 3 a.m., that dead hour when the city outside holds its breath, they begin to hear it. It isn't a scream. It isn't a whisper. It is a sound that has no place in a modern office. The sound of movement, but fundamentally incorrect movement. It is the sound of footsteps, but always, as the new security guard, Rajesh, described it in a report, half a beat slower than a human gait. It's a scuff, drag, pause, the sound of one foot landing firmly, followed by another that doesn't seem to lift properly. It echoes from the main corridor, just beyond the pool of light from the security desk. The first time Rajesh heard it, he did exactly what his training dictated. He grabbed his torch and checked the corridor. Nothing. He checked the lift. Empty. He reviewed the CCTV. The corridor was still, silent, and empty. But as he watched the monitor, a burst of static snowed the screen for the exact 3 seconds the footsteps had sounded. He logged it as an equipment fault. But the fault keeps happening, night after night. Scuff, drag, pause. The new staff are entrepreneurs of their own survival. They try to find a pattern. They check the maintenance schedules. They posit theories about the heating ducts or pressure changes from the lift shaft. They build a wall of logic against it. But the sound just walks right through. And then comes the sound that truly breaks them. It happens in the main operations room, now staffed by a sharp young freelancer named Laura. She sits at the hot desk cluster, headphones on, auditing a client's risk portfolio. The rest of the room is empty. The terminals at the desks once used by May and Chan are dark, their monitors powered down, until one isn't. In the dead quiet, a single, sharp beep cuts through her music. It's the sound of a system alert. Laura pulls her headphones off. The room is silent. And then, the monitor on May's old desk flashes to life. Not the login screen, just a single white-on-black dialog box. The kind of legacy error message from a system that should have been decommissioned years ago. Beep. She stares, her blood turning to ice. The room is empty. The chair is tucked in. No one is logged in. Beep. It isn't an error. It's a status update, a heartbeat. She calls Rajesh over. He sees it. They both stand there, two highly paid professionals, staring at a ghost in the machine. As they watch, the message vanishes. The monitor clicks off, returning to its dormant black. They don't file a report. What would they say? Monitor claimed to be alive. They would sound insane. They realized with a cold dread, exactly like May and Chan. They don't talk about it. Instead, Laura puts in for a transfer to the Singapore office. Rajesh begins looking for a new contract, citing a poor fit with the corporate culture. The night rota on that floor has a turnover rate 3 times the company average. Management just budgets for the extra recruitment costs. May and Chan are gone, but the echoes remain. The new staff, the ones who come and go. They don't see a figure. They don't hear a voice, but they hear the footsteps. Half a beat behind the rhythm of the living, and in the oppressive silence of the early hours, they hear the beep of a single monitor, dutifully reporting a presence that has long since clocked out, but has clearly, permanently, refused to leave. We, as professionals, as founders, as creators, are architects of order. Our lives are built on a foundation of data, of measurable outcomes, of cause and effect. We manage risk, we analyze trends, and we build systems to control the variables. We trust in process. We believe that everything, given enough time and resources, can be quantified, understood, and ultimately solved. A bug in the code, a dip in the market, a failure in the supply chain. These are not terrors. They are simply problems awaiting a solution. But what happens when you encounter a problem that has no data? What happens when the event you experience leaves no trace, no physical evidence, and defies every logical framework you have ever trusted? This is the true territory of the unexplainable. It's not the theatrical horror of films. It is a quiet, insidious dread that begins when logic fails. This is the reality of the phenomena we've explored. There is no proof, no data, only a bone-deep chill and an indelible memory. Think of it in terms you understand. You can analyze a competitor's strategy, but you cannot run diagnostics on a presence in your room. You can A/B test a landing page, but you cannot A/B test your own sanity when you see a figure stand in a hallway where no person can be. The experience is absolute, subjective, and terrifyingly personal. The true horror of the supernatural isn't the ghost, it's the implication. It's the sudden, violent realization that the rules you live by are, perhaps, only a polite suggestion. The unexplainable introduces a variable that cannot be measured, an influence that cannot be negotiated with, and an outcome that cannot be predicted. For an entrepreneur, for anyone whose life is dedicated to imposing will upon chaos, what could possibly be more terrifying? This is why these encounters leave a scar that logic cannot reach. You can heal the body, but no one can heal the fear of the unseen. If you, as a logical person, were to fall and break your arm, the path forward is clear. You would present yourself at A&E. A doctor would confirm the injury with an X-ray, tangible proof. A process would begin. A cast, a recovery timeline, physiotherapy. It is a manageable crisis. The body is a physical system, and we have mastered its mechanics. You might be inconvenienced, but you are not afraid. Now, consider the alternative. You are working late in your office, a modern, glass-walled building in the heart of the city. You hear a sound from the empty boardroom. You feel a sudden, unnatural drop in temperature that has nothing to do with the building's climate control. And for one fleeting second, you see something watching you through the glass partition, something that is not a reflection. You flinch, and it is gone. There is no broken bone. There is no evidence. The CCTV footage will show an empty room. The temperature log will read normal. If you tell someone, you risk your professional reputation. If you seek help, a GP might reasonably attribute it to stress, to overwork, to a trick of the light on a tired mind. The world provides you with a dozen rational explanations. But you were there. You know what you saw. The physical body is unharmed, but an existential wound has been opened. Science can offer you a sleeping tablet for the insomnia that follows, but it cannot address the reason you are awake. Psychology can help you process the feeling of fear, but it cannot validate the source of that fear. This is the crux of it. We can heal the body because we agree on the nature of the wound. But how do you heal the fear of the unseen? How do you create a process to fix a problem that, according to all available data, does not exist? The memory becomes an isolated piece of code that doesn't fit your operating system. It's a virus. It lingers. You find yourself second-guessing shadows in your own home. You feel a prickle of unease when you're the last one to leave the office. That indelible memory has proven that your fortress of logic has a breach, and you have no idea how to defend it. The most chilling part is not the encounter itself, but the silence that follows. The world moves on. Your colleagues discuss deadlines, your clients negotiate terms, and the city functions just as it did before. But you are irrevocably changed. You are now in possession of a terrible secret. The map we use to navigate reality is incomplete. This is the final, cold truth. The unexplainable doesn't just frighten us, it isolates us. It traps us in an experience that no one else can verify, leaving us alone with the bone-deep chill, holding a single, impossible memory that defies a lifetime of proof. In the end, the survivors chose silence. It wasn't a formal decision, not a pact sworn in a boardroom or a memo distributed by HR. It was the opposite. It was a vacuum, a collective, unspoken consensus that settled over the office like dust on a forgotten machine. The incident, as it was never called, was over. The crisis had been averted, or perhaps it had simply consumed itself, leaving behind a smoking crater where a project and several careers used to be. Those who remained, the ones who had navigated the political minefield or simply kept their heads down long enough, understood the new rule. You don't talk about it. It's a strange calculus, the one professionals make. In the world of entrepreneurs, freelancers, and creators, the post-mortem is gospel. You dissect failure. You find the root cause. You learn, iterate, and pivot. That is the doctrine. But this was different. This wasn't a simple failure. This was a scar. And so, no one wrote a report. To write a report would be to create an artifact. It would give the event a shape, a name, a permanent record in the company's digital archives. A report demands facts, a timeline, and, most dangerously, accountability. Who would want to sign their name to that? Who would want to be the one to point the finger, knowing that 3 more would be pointing back from across the server? A report is friction, it's baggage. And in the agile, fast-moving world they inhabited, baggage gets you left behind. The client was placated, the investors were reassured, and the next sprint had already begun. The official story was that a complex integration issue had been resolved, case closed. To write the real report The one that detailed the late-night arguments, the ignored warnings, the catastrophic oversight, and the sheer, brutal panic would be an act of career suicide. So, the silence held. It wasn't just the formal documentation that vanished. The informal channels seized up as well. No one spoke of it with colleagues. This was the more insidious silence. This was the silence at the coffee machine, the silence in the elevator, the silence over after-work drinks where conversation danced around the massive, glaring hole in their recent history. They would talk about the weather, the new client, the broken air conditioning, anything but it. They had shared a foxhole, and now they refused to even look at each other's scars. To speak of it would be to admit vulnerability. It would be to acknowledge the sheer, terrifying fragility of the systems they built and the careers they balanced upon them. It was easier to pretend it never happened, to just keep working. But the building remembered. The company, in its relentless push for optimization, had moved to a hot-desking model. Yet, the cluster of desks in the back left corner, where that team used to sit, remained perpetually empty. No one booked them. The system claimed they were available, but a silent, magnetic repulsion kept everyone away. And then, there was the light. It only happened late at night, when the entrepreneurs and the grinders, the overachievers, and the desperate not to fail were the only ones left. You'd be walking back from the kitchen, your mind numb from code or contracts, down that long, empty corridor by the old team's bay. The motion sensor lights were supposed to be efficient, turning on as you approached and off as you passed. But here, they were broken. You'd walk by, the lights would stay off. You'd pause, 10 meters past, and look back into the darkness. Flick, flick, too quick, cold, digital flashes, just bright enough to illuminate the empty chairs. Then, total darkness. It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It was a glitch, a bug in the system, a stray signal, a piece of the building's infrastructure that, like them, had been through the fire and hadn't come out quite right. No one reported that, either. You just learned to walk past the corridor a little faster. You learned to ignore the reflection of the two flashes in the glass wall of the conference room. You learned, quite simply, to live with the weight of the silence and the knowledge that some things, once broken, are never really fixed. They just become part of the background hum. So, what do you think? Was room 999 an isolated anomaly? Was the presence in suite 12C4 just a trick of the mind? Or did all these people tap into something ancient by breaking a rule they didn't understand? In many Asian cultures, there is a deep-seated belief in residual energy, what some call yin energy or ki. It's the concept that intense emotions, especially profound trauma, fear, or sudden violence, don't just disappear. They seep into the very walls, the carpet, the foundation of a place. This energy lingers, it waits, and it festers, often in the darkest, most overlooked spaces, like the empty void under a bed. This is why rules like, "Don't look under the bed after midnight" exist. They aren't merely superstitions, they are urgent warnings, born from the terrible experiences of those who looked when they shouldn't have. They remind us that a room is more than just wood and plaster. It is a container for every life and every death that has passed through it. As we've learned, some rooms never stay empty. Have you ever stayed in a room that felt occupied? Tell us your story in the comments below. If you want to explore more shadows with us, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. Next time, we follow another night shift worker in a place where cameras see more than eyes ever should.